Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. I'm really glad to be up here now because I was getting a little worried that everything that's been said before was going to steal what I was going to say. But it's good to know that what I'm bringing is in line with what is on other people's hearts. And if that's something that's connected with you already this morning, then hopefully what I bring just kind of fleshes that out for you guys a little bit and just kind of lets you see that a bit more. Because I'm going to carry on talking about worship after we've just worshipped. And looking at how we can take that in our lives and how we should live a lifestyle of worship. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to look at worship, because worship doesn't stop on a Sunday morning. It's not just the 30 minutes of singing once a week. Our entire lives should be an act of worship to God. And for me, there are at least two different types of worship. One is time spent like this morning in corporate worship, either in church or prayer meetings or places like Burn. And then also our own personal times of worship. However, there is definitely crossover between the two because you can have your own personal worship in that corporate setting. And corporate worship can be so powerful. It can change atmospheres. It can fight spiritual battles. And we're fortunate enough that we get to see that here every month. Because it's not by chance that Sundays following our burns are so often some of our best times of worship. Because of what has already taken place on the Friday night, where God has been invited in and spent those 6 hours of worship. It lays a foundation for us to come on a Sunday and build upon. And we experience some incredible times of worship because of that. And although corporate worship is powerful and it can change atmospheres, it's not what I want to focus on too much today. Because I think too many people just see worship as the songs we sing. But there is so much more to it than that. Our every action and expression should be aimed to glorify God. Because worship comes in so many different forms, and living a life filled with worship to God is so much more fulfilling than not. And that's something that I've learned personally over the last few years. It's just how important worship is in relationship with God. And this morning I want to talk about and explore how we can worship personally with God. But I think first it's important to understand why we worship. And actually there's a really easy answer to that, and it's because God is worthy of all of our praise. Even the very word worship comes from the Old English word for worthiness. The very root of the word we use today is wrapped up in God being worthy. And someone that got this, who really understood this in the Bible, was King David. So he set up 24/7 praise and worship in his reign. And as part of that, he had his officials and his leaders. They would come, and for hours, all they would do was take off their thrones and just throw them on the floor and cry out, "God, you are holy, holy, holy." Because they knew even their own titles and their own power was nothing to what God was owed in praise. And for hours, that was all they would do, is they would throw off their robes, everything that marked them as important in the kingdom, and cry out to God that you are holy, holy, holy. But beyond that, don't just take my word for it, because the Bible is full of verses and scriptures that say the same thing. From the very first book of the Bible, it talks about worship. Genesis 22, verse 5 says, "Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and then come again to you.'" All the way through into David's time, the Psalms, into the New Testament, where in Ephesians 5 it says, "But be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with all your heart, always and for everything, giving thanks in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to God the Father." And then on into Revelations and the end times and eternity, where it says in Revelations 19, "After this I heard what seemed to be a loud voice of a great magnitude in heaven, crying out, 'Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and power belong to our God.'" And then just in those three couple of verses, we see people all the way from the start of time worshipping, all the way through to the end of times and into eternity worshipping. And those verses from Ephesians telling us what worship should look like, and that it should only be to God. Because it is so easy to worship things not of God. How many of us are a little bit too in love and worship something that doesn't deserve it? Our cars, Jake's not here this morning, but he loves his cars. They lose half their value the second you drive them off the forecourt, and then they're going to break down at some point. A TV show whose ending's going to let you down. A person who you put all your trust and hope and worship into. Because people worship all of those things, even me. And when I was a child, I absolutely worshipped this guy. He was a big, blonde Danish guy called Peter Schmeichel. As I'm sure you all know, he was Man United's goalkeeper for most of the 90s, and he's also the greatest goalkeeper of all time. And if anyone disagrees, I can pray for you later. And as a child, all I wanted to be was him. I had posters of him, posters, not just one, but probably 3 or 4 of him on my walls. I had his jerseys. I used to pop the collars like he did. I would watch VHS tapes of him being interviewed and highlights of his greatest saves over and over again. And I did all that because I wanted to emulate how he played football. I wanted to shout at the defenders like he did. I wanted to pick up the same style he did. I wanted to stand as he did. And if I could have figured out a way, I would have had a rosy red nose like him as well. But like everything else that we worship that isn't God, he fell short, because only God is worthy of our praise. And on the 26th of May, 1999, he played his last game for Man United, and he left on the highest of highs. He captained Man United to their greatest triumph, in the greatest comeback, in the greatest European game of all time. Looking at you there, Joe. And lifted treble. And that was such a brilliant way to end his career at Man United. He didn't want to play 50 games a season anymore, so he was going off to sunnier shores in Portugal, where the going was a bit easier. I thought it was the perfect ending. He left on the highest of highs, but 3 years later, he returned to Manchester. Not in the brilliant red of United, but with Man City. And that man that I placed above all others, that I thought perfect and infallible, he let me down in the worst way. And everything that is not God, that we worship, that we lived above everything else, will let us down as well. No matter how much we might want to think that they won't or they don't, none of them are perfect and none of them are God. And there are even people within a church setting that fall into this trap. They become so connected to the people that they listen to or the people that are on stage that they begin to worship them instead of God. Now, Phoebe's an incredible worship leader and she's an incredible singer. But do we enjoy it so much that we begin to worship what she is doing and not worshipping God on a Sunday morning? Or do we have our favourite worship group and nothing else is good but them? If it's not Bethel, it's not much. If it's not the Gaithers, it's nothing. If we start to identify them as our worship instead, and we become reliant on them to lead us into worship, whereas we should already be arriving on a Sunday morning with a heart full of worship and ready to join with the church in worship. Because the people on stage are just the same as us, maybe with a few different talents. And they're only there to help you worship, to enable you to worship better and not to be worshipped. And just like everything above, they're not God and they're not worthy of our praise and they fall short. Because none of them are the Most High God who sent his Son to die. Who sent his Son to die on a cross that we might spend eternity in heaven with him and praising and worshipping him. And knowing that every bit of worship that we pour out, God sees it, he hears it and he receives it. No word or action that we have goes unnoticed. And in John 4, verse 24, it says, God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and truth. So we must worship in spirit and truth. It's not that we can, or we should, or we might, but must. Like there's no other option when we worship but to worship in spirit and truth. You know, you could probably train a parrot to sing some of the songs we've sung this morning, but just because it says the words doesn't give it any meaning. We should be doing more than just singing songs. Our songs should be an outpouring of love from our hearts. And one of the most incredible things about God is that he knows our hearts, even better than we do. He knows our needs, our feelings, and our wants, but he also knows the root of all our actions. He knows when the words we speak are full of truth, or if we're just going through the motions. And I know that because I did it for years. I would stand and sing every song, but my mind could have been a million miles away, and my heart definitely wasn't worshipping in spirit and truth. But it was actually through those times of corporate worship that I actually began to develop my own personal worship. that during those times, I would actually start to focus on what I was saying and singing and what God was saying and what he meant as well. And from there, my relationship with God began to grow. And as it grew, my desire to worship him grew as well. But not just in those corporate settings on a Sunday morning or at a burn, but in the everyday. I wanted my own life to glorify God in my every action. Because when we worship in truth and spirit, God doesn't change. God is the same as he was when Abraham worshipped, when David worshipped, when Paul and Silas worshipped. God doesn't need our worship. He's not some mythical deity who needs people to praise and worship to power him. He's not some great and mighty God who relies on our worship and our sacrifice to make him who he is. He is the same great and mighty God if 7 people sing his praise or 7 billion. But what happens when we worship is that we change. And as my love for worship grew, so did the amount of time I spent worshipping grow. Despite what the news might want you to believe, we live in an extraordinary time where we are really blessed by technology. And I can leave here today, and I've got probably about 5,000 songs on my iPhone, of which 500 or so are worship songs. And I could pick any of those 500 songs to listen to on the way home and to carry on worshipping God throughout my day. I can worship God in spirit and truth. And when you do that with music, it's contagious. The more of it you want to do. Now, I'm quite lucky in the sense that I get to be driven to work by my mum sometimes. I wouldn't say I'm lucky enough to work with her. It's a little different. And she likes Radio 4, which isn't terrible. It can be informative. But there's only so much of the Archers you can listen to. So I make her listen to my worship music instead. And actually, even for her, for someone who's been a Christian and is a leader at church, those times spent listening to worship music has actually led her to listen to worship a lot more as well. That influence of listening to it a few times, it's contagious. And now I often put a song on, and she's trying to get me to buy it whilst we're driving, holding her thumbprint across onto the Touch ID. And it's so easy to do nowadays. Like, nearly every person here will have at least a 30-minute opportunity in a day where they can listen to music. You know, if it's in the car, as you commute, or even whilst you are working. And the more regularly that we spend time worshipping God, then the more we begin to change. Because when we worship, we open ourselves to Holy Spirit. And we experience more of God, and our relationship with him grows. Our personal worship strengthens our personal relationship with God. It draws us closer to him, and it should push and inspire us to be more like Jesus every day. And the more our relationship grows, the more we see the opportunities for worship in everything. That we stop seeing worship as just time spent together on a Sunday morning, but we see it in our everyday lives. Because so much of what we already do can be worship, if we were doing it in spirit and truth. Even tithing is worship if we do it in spirit and truth. You know, not begrudgingly setting aside 10% after tax to give, but actually seeing that as an opportunity to worship God and to give to him and to plough and sow into his kingdom. Our entire perspective begins to change. How you want to spend your time becomes an opportunity to worship, to give him what you do in your day-to-day life, to spend your Sundays differently, serving, and using that as an opportunity to worship. And I know that the more we worship God, the stronger our relationship with him grows, and the more we get to know his heart. And I know from my own experience of worship that each and every time I'm left in awe of God and with a stronger desire to worship and serve him. And maybe for some people that's scary. As Caroline was talking earlier about the people behind the waterfall and not quite reaching out. Now, I'm sure there's people in the room like that who feel really happy where they are and they're comfortable where they are. And you don't want to be challenged by God. You want to carry on doing what you are doing and doing what you know you like. And the idea of changing may be a really hard one because you know there are things in your life that God doesn't want you to do. But you think that all the time you keep God at an arm's distance, then it would be easier to do them without feeling challenged by him to stop and to stop doing them. Your nights spent getting drunk, the way we act when we're with certain people, how we treat those around us, the things that we watch, even the music that we listen to. But they're all things that God wants to change in people's lives, and all things that keep us at a distance from God. when all he wants is for us to know him intimately and to know his heart. And we have an opportunity to do that when we worship, because worship is powerful. And through worship, we can see God do incredible things. But that doesn't mean that when we worship, God makes all of our problems go away as a sign of gratitude. And no matter how full of worship our hearts and lives may be, it doesn't stop us from facing trials or hard times. But what worship does do for relationship with God is bring peace and calm in the storms. Even when we're in the eye of the storms, our worship should never change. We shouldn't be fair weather worshippers, just pouring out our praise to God when the going's good, but then going silent when the hard times hit. Because no matter the good and the bad that we face, our level of worship should only ever grow. We could be in the darkest places of our lives, but that is when we need to worship God the most. Because in those times is when we need a relationship with him the most. Because despite all the change that happens around us, there's always one constant, and that is God. And there's two songs that I really love that actually serve as reminders for me as to how important worship is. And one is by Hillsong, and it's called Even When It Hurts. And the song talks about how, even when we are our weakest, when it might feel like it's the hardest thing in the world to focus our hearts on worshiping, that is the most important. And one of the verses is, even when the fight seems lost, I'll praise you. Even when it hurts like hell, I'll praise you. Even when it makes no sense to sing, louder then I'll sing your praise. So to make that choice to worship God when it is hardest is when it's the most important. Instead of looking to blame God and saying, why are you letting this happen to me? Why me? Instead, we should choose to worship. Because worship is a choice. And it is so important to make that choice every single day. And the other song that I really love is by a group called The Belonging Co. And it's called Peace, Be Still. And it has one of the most incredible choruses, which is, say the word, and I will set my feet upon the sea until I'm dancing in the deep. Because stepping out in relationship with God can be scary, knowing that the closer you are to God, the more you will be challenged. Challenged on the things that you are doing, that you want to do, and that you're going to do. Challenged on the way you spend your time and your life and your money. And that idea of stepping out into the waves and facing the new and the different and the unknown, it can be terrifying. But worship brings relationship, and relationship brings peace. We can be stood in the deep waters, but we'll be stood there knowing God is with us, and he is by our side, and we are trusting in him and what he is doing. And then we'll be dancing in the deep, knowing that he is there with us. To the point where we are worshipping God no matter what. Because God deserves our worship in the bad, even as much as he does in the good. In Acts 16 is a great example of this, where you have Paul and Silas. They have been going around evangelizing and have upset someone, and they've been thrown into jail. But in the midnight hour, whilst locked in chains, they're singing praises to God. Even in what seemed like the darkest of situations, their desire was to worship God above all things. How many of us, if we were thrown into jail for our faith, will be in there singing and worshipping? It would have been so easy for them in that situation just to give up and quit and be miserable and say, no more, God. I'm not doing this. I'm not getting thrown in jail again. Just once I get out, I'm living my life my own way. But they still chose to worship. And we should be the same in our lives. Our lives should reflect God and worship him in every moment, the good and especially bad. And those verses in Acts 16, for me, the most incredible thing about them that I can take from worship is that worship is easy. Once you've made that decision, worship is easy. It's not difficult. You don't need any talent to worship. You don't need any fancy equipment. It's not some immense puzzle to be figured out. It doesn't matter how good or bad you can sing, because I can't sing, and I can't play any instruments, and I can't dance, but none of that matters. Our worship isn't about skill, it's about our hearts. And our love and our worship that comes from our heart is what God desires. Even the sweetest of singing voices means nothing in worship if it's not done in spirit and truth. But as we see in Acts, with Paul and Silas, all they needed to worship was themselves. They had no instruments. They didn't have any words on the screen. They were locked in chains, but still they worshipped. And then as you read on about their lives throughout the New Testament, you can witness the incredible relationship that they had with God. And their worship would have been a massive part of that, would have enabled that relationship to grow and to trust God and to hear what he was saying and to do what he wanted them to do. So when the band come back up in a minute and we sing our final song, worship God with all your heart. Don't hold anything back, and take this time of corporate worship together and carry it into the week coming. And as we go into the week, ask God to reveal more of himself in you as you worship. Use this morning to connect with God and then spend the rest of the week in worship. And you'd be surprised what you discover when you do that. If we go into the week full of worship and expectant of what your time with God will look like, and you start to find ways to worship that you didn't even know possible, because worship isn't linear. It's not just the same thing for every person. You could watch people on Sunday morning worship, and even in the similar things they do, not one person will hold their hands and worship the same. But we're fortunate, especially for me when I go to Burn, that we get to see people come and worship in all different ways. And people can worship with artwork, in different forms of singing. Andy's come in the last couple of weeks and he's rapped for us. He's rapped at Burn. And each of them is worship. And for each person is an expression of their worship to God that helps them feel closest to him and to grow their relationship with him. So just use this last song as a launch pad. So a launch pad to worship God into the week that's coming and to find out how you love to worship him more. And just take that opportunity to get to know him better and to get to learn more of his heart and to know him more and enjoy your time in worship.